Hey guys, welcome back to PJT Forging. About 2 years ago now, I released my first YouTube video on this channel, which was about making a Touchmark stamp. To this day, it's my most viewed video, and I don't know why. It was bad. I want to make a Touchmark stamp. Really, really bad. So, with that in mind, I figure, let's redo it. Here is making a Touchmark stamp Mark II. So, as with the first video I made about this, step one is going to be designing a Touchmark. Now, obviously you want it to be something personal to you. For me, it's literally just my initials. It is a P, which goes round. There's the T for my last name, and J is my middle name. And Bob's your uncle, there's my design in a nutshell. So, next is how to figure out how to put this onto a material. Now, the very first Touchmark stamp I made, the one you saw me make in the first video, was this little bad boy here. Full disclosure, when I made this one, I actually made it the wrong way around. As you can see, the print here matches exactly what I've drawn out there. And obviously when you're stamping, you want it to be the reverse. So I actually made a mess up straight off the bat. I just never actually confessed to it in the video, so here it is, here's my confession. Right, getting back to the subject in hand, I made this out of an old chisel, which brings me neatly onto the point of it doesn't really matter what you make your Touchmark out of. I've got various few examples here, so like I say, this one was actually a botch job, so I couldn't really use that straight off the bat. So what I did instead was I made this one out of another old chisel, and I actually kept the base plate. You can see on here I've just got an arrow showing me which way round is top on this, so I don't have to muck around too much when I've got a hot piece of steel in front of me. I know immediately which way to stamp it. But like I say, this was made out of an old chisel. Now chisels obviously are designed for impacting on other materials, so I figured that would be perfect for making the Touchmark, and this has survived years without any problem at all. So if you can always get hold of something like that. Now for the Touchmark I'm about to make, I'm going to be using this stuff, which is EN24T, which is pretty much the equivalent of 4340. The reason I'm using this stuff is it tends to withstand heat very well, which obviously for a Touchmark stamp is ideal. You quite often see blacksmith tooling or things like axles made out of this stuff because it's so heat resistant. So that's my thinking, and that's why I'm going to be using this in this video. However, if you don't have a steel supplier who specialises in this stuff nearby, which fortunately I do, you would be absolutely fine in making your Touchmark stamp out of just a piece of standard mild steel. There is nothing special about this, it is as cheap as it comes. At the end of the day, so long as the piece of steel you're punching with is cold and the piece of steel you're punching is hot, you're not going to have any problems. Certainly not short term. After years and years, you may start to develop some wear and tear, but honestly, really, makes no difference. Use what you got. So, now that we've got our design and we've got our material, the next thing is to start marking out our design on the material. Now, like I just mentioned, when you transfer your design across onto the end of the piece of material you want to use, you need to reverse it. As you can see, this is now the opposite to the one I initially drew out. Like I say, obviously, when you're actually stamping into a hot piece of steel, your design is going to be transferred in reverse. So make sure, unlike I did the first time I did this, when you put your design onto the end of your piece of material, you put it on the wrong way round to start with, so that it's the right way round when you stamp. Learn from my mistakes. Now, one of the reasons I'm actually redoing my Touchmark is I actually want a slightly smaller version of the one I've already got. As you can see, the one I'm currently using is probably going to end up being about twice the size of the new one, which is fine when I'm making my big projects, but for the smaller projects, I want something a little bit smaller and a little bit neater. So, first thing I need to do, I need to drill out 2 holes for my design. One, I'm going to be using a 3mm bit, the next one I'm going to be using a 2mm bit, just in the corner of the J there. Something like that. Next, I'm just going to cut away my excess stock with an angle grinder. Right, the next step is going to be getting rid of the outside stock. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to taper it down slightly all the way around, and then I'm going to start working on the detail. Now, as you might have seen in my last video, this is entirely possible with files, and I will certainly be doing some of it with files, but for the main bulk, I'm going to be using my bolt grinder right there. Well, I think I've got it about as close as I can now with the belt sander, so now it's time to move on to the files. Right, we're now moving on to the rotary tool cutting disc to try and get into the extra small areas like the inside of the J here. There we go, takes a little while, but you end up with something like that. And as you can see, compared to the other one, it's about half the size, so perfect. Right, the very last thing I've got to do with this is I'm just going to drill a very small hole just here so that when I stamp, the air that gets trapped inside this tube has somewhere to escape out of. I found that when I did this on the larger one, it actually made quite a big difference. So I'm just going to add it in using this tiny little burr on the end of my rotary tool here. Well, I guess today would be a good day to light the forge and talk about heat treating. But I'm afraid I'm not going to talk to you until the forge is lit, because it's absolutely freezing in here. So there. Toasty warm. Okie dokie, let's talk about heat treating. Now I've obviously chosen to make the actual touch mark on the end of this piece of EN24 steel very small, and as a result I want to try my best to do a proper heat treat on this. The thing is, EN24 steel needs to be heat treated in quite a specific way, and I'll be honest, I don't know if I've got the means of doing it that precisely, so I'm probably going to have to do a bit of a MacGyver type job on this. Now, if you were using O1 tool steel like you did for my first punch, the process is much easier. All you basically need to do is heat it up to a dull red/orange colour and then quench it into warm-ish oil. Now for me, I just use vegetable oil and that seemed to work fine, although people always talk about Parks or motor oil, things like that, but so long as it's oil not water, it doesn't really make that much difference. Now if you're going for the mild steel approach, I'll be honest with you, there's not a great deal of point in trying to heat treat it. Mild steel has a very low carbon content, and as a result it doesn't really harden very well at all. Now that said, you can still try and it will have some effect, and mild steel is quite easy because you can quench it straight into water with very low risk of cracks or splintering or even warping happening. So in some ways mild steel is the easier option. Now if I'd made my first touch mark out of mild steel and made it this sort of size, honestly I probably wouldn't really be bothering at all. I think it'd be fine just to leave as is. Like I said earlier, so long as the stamp itself is cold and the piece of metal that you're stamping is hot, you're not really going to have any issues. Now going back to the EN24T stamp I've made, my understanding is the T means that it's in effectively like an annealed state. It's easy to machine and work with. However, I obviously need to get this into a hardened state, which will require heating up and quenching. But the process, like I say, is quite precise, and it requires me to get this to a temperature of around, I've forgotten, let me double check. Okay, I've revised my numbers and I need to heat this up to around 850 degrees Celsius. I then need to quench it in oil, similar to the O1 tool steel. But then for the tempering process, whereas normally when you're tempering, if you're looking for that sort of gold, blue, purple, those sort of tempering colours, you're looking around the sort of 250s to 300 degrees Celsius. Now for this stuff to temper properly, you need to temper it to 660 degrees Celsius, and I've got no means of measuring that accurately. However, what I did find is when I was actually cutting off the excess EN24 stock, the heat from the angle grinder was creating tempering colours on this, and I actually found that, I don't know how well you can see this, but I could not drill into it after it had tempered. So potentially all I'm going to do a normal heat and quench, so I'm going to get this to a dull orange, quench into oil, and then I'm going to temper it until I see tempering colours, and then basically play it by ear and test the hardness as I go. I'm hoping with a bit of jiggery-pokery and a bit of experimentation I can get this to a decent hardness level. Now obviously I don't want this too hard, because otherwise that's going to mean it's brittle and it's going to make the end shatter, so it's a bit of a balancing act. Not really sure how this is going to go, but we'll give it a try. Now, let's assume that if you're watching this video, you are a beginner to blacksmithing who wants to get started making their first Touchmark stamp. You might not have a forge like this. Psst, if you look at my videos, there's an entire playlist about how to make this. However, you don't need a forge like this in order to create your own Touchmark. In the first video I made, I managed to create my Touchmark using some charcoal in a baking tray, a camp bed inflator, and a waste paper bin full of vegetable oil. So it's entirely possible for you to do it yourself. However, these days, I'm far more advanced than using vegetable oil in a waste paper bin. Because now I've got a copper pot. Right, before I light the forge again and get quenching, I'm going to do a little bit of forging on this. I'm just going to put a hexagon on the end. I'm going to put a small flat section at the front and at the back of the Touchmark so that I can get some reference points for which way round I've got it when I'm getting ready to stamp. So, let's light up the forge and let's do that first. I'm also going to put this piece of bar in to start with, which I can use to preheat the oil. First we're going to preheat the oil. I'm going to give this a good brush, try and get all the scale off, and I'm just going to wait for it to cool down a little bit more before we quench. We'll give this a bit of a dry off now that it's cool enough to touch, and we'll see if it escapes a file, and hopefully we've hardened this thing successfully. That sounds about right. I reckon that's a success. So, what I'm going to do to temper it, as you can see, I've filed off some of the scale, and I've got it back to a silver finish, and I'm just going to put the tail end back in the forge there, and I'm going to wait until I see the temper colours coming up through the clean steel. I'm not really sure what I'm aiming for here. I'm probably going to stick with going for like a pale blue colour, but I'll be honest with you, this steel is complicated, and I'm not 100% sure, but we'll give it a whirl, and we'll see how it goes. Right, that's about where I want it, so we'll give that another little quench just to cool it down, and then hopefully we're pretty much there. I'm no longer worried about quenching this in water, by the way, due to the fact it wasn't at a critical temperature. And hopefully you can make out that there's a nice light blue hue to the piece. There we go, just tidying up the hexagon slightly. Well, it looks good. Well, I had a few little goes, I had a bit of a play, and I've got to say, I think it came out really nicely. And when you add to it a few little letters, it comes out even better. Although, granted, I need to work on getting them a bit straighter, but there you go. One Touchmark stamp, all complete. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. If you could like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed, that would be doing me a huge favour. And I'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye! Yeah, me now. What do you think of this? One day you'll grant me your favour for my work.